Get ready for a story that will send shivers down your spine. A chilling tale of love, betrayal, and a secret buried for 2 decades in the unforgiving heart of the Swiss Alps. Imagine a love story set against the breathtaking backdrop of towering peaks and glistening glaciers. A young German couple, Stefan and Petra, embark on what should have been the most romantic climbing adventure of their lives. But then, something went horribly, terrifyingly wrong. Something unthinkable happened. Only one of them returned from that frozen peak, barely alive, forever changed. For 20 long years, Petra was presumed lost to the mountain's cruel embrace. Her family mourned, her sister clung to a fading hope, and the world moved on. The mountains, they remember. As our climate changes, triggering catastrophic avalanches, the glacier began to surrender its icy grip, exposing not just a body, but a truth. So horrifying, so unthinkable, it would shatter 2 decades of silence and ignite a desperate search for answers. Before we dive deeper into this captivating mystery, if you're as gripped as I am by tales of secrets uncovered, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss how this incredible story unfolds. The heavy oak door of the Alpengasthof Edelweiss was not designed for gentle openings. It was built to withstand the fierce alpine winds, to offer a sturdy shield against the mountain's wrath. But on that late August evening in 2002, it was ripped open with a desperate freezing force that echoed through the cozy lodge. A blast of wind, sharp enough to snuff out candles, tore through the room, carrying with it a flurry of snow and a figure that looked more like a ghost than a human being. He didn't walk in. He collapsed over the threshold, a ragged shape of blue and orange against the warm, inviting wood of the entryway. The half-dozen patrons, their quiet conversations and the gentle clinking of glasses suddenly silenced, froze. Even Klaus, the stout lodge owner, stood rooted to the spot, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a look of stunned horror. This was Stefan Fischer, or what was left of him. His face was a ghastly mask of windburn and frostbite, his lips cracked in a terrifying shade of blue. His beard, caked with ice, clung to his gaunt cheeks. His gloveless hands, swollen and waxy, were a telltale sign of severe exposure, a silent scream of the ordeal he had endured. He stumbled a few steps forward, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. His high-tech mountaineering gear battered and abused, almost unrecognizable. He tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped his throat was a dry, rattling gasp, a sound of utter desolation. He was only 31 years old, but the lines etched into his frozen face made him look decades older, aged by an ordeal no human should ever have to face. Klaus was the first to snap out of his trance, rushing forward and grabbing Stefan before he could fall. "My God," he muttered, the bone-deep cold radiating from Stefan's body seeping into him even through his thick jacket. He and another guest, a burly man with a kind face, half-carried, half-dragged the trembling man to the large stone fireplace that dominated the room, its flames offering a beacon of warmth. They carefully peeled away his stiff, frozen outer layers, each piece of fabric seeming to resist, clinging to him like a second skin. Klaus's wife, a woman with a gentle spirit and a hurried step, rushed over with thick wool blankets and a steaming mug of tea, but Stefan's hands were so ravaged by frostbite that he was physically unable to hold it. As the warmth, slowly, agonizingly, began to seep back into his battered body, his shivering intensified, evolving into violent, uncontrollable spasms that shook his entire frame. And then, through the desperate chattering of his teeth, he finally managed to form words. They weren't for himself, not a plea for comfort or warmth. They were for someone else, a name torn from the very depths of his soul. "Petra," he choked out, his eyes wide and vacant, staring past the concerned faces surrounding him, past the dancing flames into a terrifying void only he could see. "Petra, she's gone." The local gendarmerie, accustomed to dealing with lost hikers and minor skiing accidents, were summoned from the nearby village. 2 officers arrived to find a scene of controlled urgency. The lodge now quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and the low, strained voices. Stefan, now swathed in layers of blankets, tended to by a local doctor who confirmed severe frostbite and profound exhaustion, was coherent enough to give his account. He sat at a heavy wooden table, his bandaged hands resting uselessly in his lap, his voice hollowed out by grief and the biting alpine air. He told them everything, a harrowing tale of love, adventure, and sudden brutal loss. He and his girlfriend, 28-year-old Petra Kruger, were experienced climbers. This trip to the Alps was supposed to be the highlight of their summer, a challenging but incredibly rewarding ascent. They had been making good time, the weather holding beautifully until it didn't. High on a glacial plateau, the sky had betrayed them with shocking speed. A serene blue morning had devolved into a blinding whiteout, a terrifying wall of snow that didn't just fall but seemed to rush horizontally, a malevolent force erasing the sky, the ground, and every inch of space between. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the world shrinking to the icy, suffocating embrace of the storm. They were roped together, moving cautiously, their trust in each other their only guide, when the ground beneath Petra simply vanished. Stefan's voice cracked, tears welling in his raw eyes, as he described the sickening lurch of the rope. The sudden, terrifying absence of her weight. He'd been pulled forward, scrambling desperately for purchase on the treacherous ice, but she was gone. He screamed her name into the howling wind, the sound swallowed whole by the storm's fury. He crawled to the very edge of the gaping maw she had disappeared into, a deep, dark blue crevasse, hidden by a fresh, treacherous layer of snow. He called and called, his voice raw, hoarse with desperation, but the only answer was the shriek of the wind, a cruel, mocking silence. There was no sound from below, no cry for help, nothing. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that he couldn't go down after her. It would have been suicide, a second senseless death. The storm was now a full-blown blizzard, a white inferno, and his only chance, he explained, was to survive. He had used his ice axe to dig a desperate snow cave, a coffin-sized shelter against the relentless wind, and huddled. Inside, for what he thought was 2 agonizing days drifting in and out of consciousness, his food gone, his hope dwindling with every passing hour. When a brief, mocking break in the weather finally came, he stumbled his way down the mountain, a grueling, half-lucid journey back to the fragile comfort of civilization. The officers listened intently, their faces grim, their expressions etched with a quiet sympathy. The story was terrifying, yes, but tragically, it was not an unfamiliar one in these unforgiving mountains. Everything about Stefan's condition, the severe frostbite, the profound dehydration, the clear psychological trauma, corroborated his harrowing tale. There was no reason to doubt him, as they knew was the brutal reality of the Alps. Before the night was over, an official missing person report was filed for Petra Kruger. A full-scale search and rescue operation, a beacon of hope against the bleak reality, was mobilized, set to begin at first light. And in a quiet, sterile office miles away, one of the officers made the most difficult call of all. In a peaceful German suburb, the phone rang in the Kruger household. Petra's sister, Simona, answered, her world about to be irrevocably fractured by the devastating news that her beloved sister had been taken by the ice. At the first hint of dawn, the air at the base of the Alps was filled with a purposeful, mechanical hum. The search and rescue operation for Petra Kruger launched with the full, unwavering force of Alpine protocol. A state-of-the-art helicopter, its rotors slicing through the thin, frigid air, lifted off from a makeshift landing zone, carrying a team of seasoned rescuers. These were men who understood the mountain not as a picturesque postcard, but as a living, breathing entity with an unforgiving nature. They were dressed in bright, functional gear, their faces set with a grim professionalism that spoke of countless similar missions. Some successful, many not. The search area was vast and treacherous. From the air, the glacial plateau that Stefan had described was a chaotic seascape of frozen waves. A blinding expanse of white fissured with countless dark blue lines, crevasses. Each one was a potential tomb, a silent, icy maw waiting to swallow its next victim. The conditions on the ground were just as Stefan had reported. Fresh, deep layer of snow blanketed everything, masking the landscape's true dangers. It was unstable, prone to shifting with a whisper, and made every single step a calculated risk, a gamble with life itself. The search teams deployed on the ground moved with painstaking slowness, probing the snow ahead of them with long poles, their breath pluming in the frigid air like ghostly sighs. The mountain, it seemed, was actively working against them, jealously guarding its secrets. For 2 agonizing days, the search yielded nothing. The teams focused on the quadrant Stefan had indicated, a grueling grid search in punishingly low temperatures. They were looking for any sign at all. A scrap of fabric, a discarded piece of equipment, a glove, anything that would narrow the search from miles to feet. But the blizzard had been brutally efficient, wiping the slate clean, leaving no trace. The mountain held its secrets tightly, a silent, impenetrable fortress. The mood at the base camp, initially crackling with the electric energy of the rescue effort, began to sober into a quiet, gnawing dread. Hope, a fragile flame, began to flicker. It was on the third day that an unexpected communication arrived, not from the silent mountain, but from the outside world. An email landed in the inbox of the local gendarmerie. It was from a German couple, Heinrich and Greta Schmidt, who had been vacationing in the area the previous week. They had seen a brief news report about the missing climber, and the name Petra Kruger had struck a chord. Attached to the email was a digital photograph. The authorities opened the file, and there, on the screen, was the image of a vibrant, smiling couple. Framed against the very same majestic peaks the rescuers were now scouring. On the left, a woman with dark blonde hair and a bright, infectious smile, wearing a distinctive pink and purple jacket. On the right, a man with a red beanie, his arm around her, raising an ice axe in a gesture of pure, unadulterated joy. It was Petra Kruger and Stefan Fischer, alive and full of life, just hours before the tragedy. And in their email, the Schmidts explained the context. They were amateur photographers and had been hiking near a trailhead when they crossed paths with the young couple. They had exchanged pleasantries, remarking on the perfect weather. Stefan and Petra had been so full of life and excitement that Heinrich had offered to take their picture with his new digital camera. It was a fleeting, happy moment, two sets of strangers connecting briefly over a shared love for the mountains. They had exchanged email addresses, promising to send the photo along. Now, with heavy hearts, they were sending it to the police with their deepest condolences and prayers. The photograph was a gut punch to the investigators. It was a poignant timestamp of the last moments of normalcy, a ghost from just a few hours before the tragedy. It was immediately invaluable. Confirmed the exact clothing and gear they were wearing, details that could be crucial for spotters from the air. But more than that, it served as a stark, heartbreaking reminder of what was lost, a vibrant life suddenly extinguished. A copy was printed and pinned to the operations board at the base camp, silent, powerful testament to the mission's solemn purpose. Meanwhile, Stefan, against stern medical advice, refused to remain idle. His hands were heavily bandaged, his face still raw and peeling from the frostbite, but a desperate, unyielding fire burned in his eyes. He insisted he could help. He couldn't join the teams on the ground, but he was taken up in the helicopter, hovering over the terrifyingly uniformed landscape. From the air, he pointed downwards, his bandaged hand trembling with a mixture of pain and desperate hope. "There," he said, his voice strained, a raw whisper. "The terrain looks right, I think. I think it was one of those." He indicated a cluster of large crevasses, his memory blurred by trauma and the disorienting whiteout. His grief was palpable, his desperation to find her raw and convincing. The rescuers took his information, focusing their efforts on the specific crevasses he'd highlighted. But the landscape had been irrevocably altered by the storm, and certainty was a luxury no one had. Soon after, a small rental car, worn and mud-splattered, pulled into the lodge's parking lot. A woman emerged, her movements stiff with anxiety, her face pale and drawn. It was Simona Kruger, Petra's sister. She had driven through the night, a frantic, sleepless journey fueled by a terrible, desperate hope. She was the mirror image of her sister in the photograph, but her face was etched with a fear that was the polar opposite of Petra's joyful expression. She immediately sought out the lead rescuer, her questions tumbling out in a rush, desperate and breathless. Had they found anything? Was it possible she survived the fall? Petra was strong, she explained, her voice cracking with emotion. She was an experienced climber. She had her pack, her gear. She could have made a shelter. Simona's presence added a new, poignant layer of human tragedy to the procedural operation. She would sit in the lodge for hours, her gaze fixed on the imposing, indifferent mountain. A mug of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. A silent vigil. She and Stefan spoke in hushed, pained tones, united in their shared grief. Two people bound by their love for Petra, waiting for a miracle from a mountain that rarely gave them, but the miracle never came. After 8 long days of relentless searching, of brave men risking their lives in a futile quest, the operation reached its inevitable, heartbreaking conclusion. The lead rescuer, a man with weathered skin and sorrowful eyes, assembled his team, their faces etched with disappointment and quiet resignation. They had explored every crevasse Stefan had pointed out, lowering cameras hundreds of feet into the blue-black ice. Their desperate probes yielding nothing but cold, empty darkness. The weather was turning again, another storm front moving in, making any further ground search prohibitively dangerous. A formal meeting was held in the lodge, the air heavy with unspoken grief. The lead rescuer laid out the facts to Simona and Stefan, his tone gentle, compassionate, but firm. They had exhausted all viable options. The probability of survival, after this much time, given the fall and the subsequent extreme temperatures, was 0. To continue the search, he explained, would be to needlessly risk the lives of his men. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, each one a death knell to hope. The search for Petra Kruger was officially being called off. Simona let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Her last sliver of hope extinguished, replaced by a crushing emptiness. Stefan sat motionless, his head bowed. His bandaged hands clenched into fists in his lap, a silent testament to his profound despair. The official report would state that Petra was presumed dead, her body tragically irrecoverable, entombed somewhere within the vast, indifferent glacier. The case was closed. The mountain had claimed her, and it was not giving her back. In the months and years that followed the tragedy, the sharp edges of grief began to dull for the outside world, settling into the soft focus of memory. The story of Petra Kruger became a cautionary tale whispered among alpine enthusiasts, a somber reminder of the mountain's brutal supremacy, its power to take and never return. For Stefan Fischer, the physical recovery was a slow, agonizing process. The frostbite had cost him the tips of 2 fingers on his left hand, a permanent physical reminder of his ordeal, a silent scar on his very being. For a long time, he was a haunted figure, his trauma worn like a second skin, casting a long, chilling shadow over him. He moved away from the mountains, settling in a bustling city far from any snow-capped peaks, and threw himself into his career as a highly successful architect. He rarely spoke of Petra or the accident, and friends learned not to ask, sensing the unspoken pain. It was a closed chapter, a vault of pain that he seemed determined to keep locked away, buried deep. Slowly, life began to reassemble itself around him. He met someone new, a kind woman who knew of his tragic past, and treated it with a delicate respect, never pushing, always understanding. To everyone who knew him, Stefan Fischer was a survivor, a man who had stared into the abyss and had, by some miracle, clawed his way back. But for Simona Kruger, time did not heal. It calcified. The official narrative of a tragic accident was a story she heard, but never truly absorbed. In the quiet solitude of her apartment, the case of her sister's disappearance remained wide open, a gaping wound that refused to close. Grief had sharpened her mind into a forensic tool, a relentless, unwavering focus. She had requested and received a copy of the official incident report, and she read it over and over until the pages grew soft and worn with handling. Each word etched into her memory. She had the maps from the search, the weather reports from those fateful days, and a printed copy of Stefan's official statement. And one detail, one seemingly small, insignificant piece of the narrative, began to snag in her mind, pulling at the very fabric of the entire story. It was the rope. Stefan had been clear in his account. They were roped together for safety on the glacier. This was standard, non-negotiable procedure for any experienced climbers. A safety line connects to people, ensuring that if one slips, the other can act as an anchor, a human counterweight. Simona, who had climbed with Petra many times, knew this intimately, the feel of the rope, the trust it implied, woven into her very being. She replayed the scenario in her head 1,000 times, each time hoping for a different outcome, but the cold logic remained. If Petra, weighing over 130 pounds with her gear, had suddenly plunged into a crevasse, the force on that rope would have been immense, violent, a sudden, catastrophic jerk. It would have been a powerful pull, strong enough to rip Stefan off his feet, to drag him across the ice toward the same abyss. At best, he would have been left with deep, burning rope burns, a dislocated shoulder, or severe bruising around his harness. At worst, he would have been pulled in with her, 2 lives swallowed by the same icy maw. Yet in his statement, Stefan described being pulled forward and managing to scramble for purchase, somehow regaining his footing. His injuries, while severe, were all related to exposure and frostbite. There was no mention in the medical report of any injuries consistent with arresting a major fall, no evidence of the violent, desperate struggle she knew would have ensued. How had he unclipped himself from the rope, from his falling partner, in the middle of a blinding blizzard, without sustaining any of the expected trauma? This question, initially a whisper in Simona's mind, grew into a roar, echoing relentlessly in her thoughts. It was a detail that didn't fit, a gear that wouldn't mesh in the intricate clockwork of the official story. She started making calls. Her first was to an old friend of Petra's, an expert alpine guide, a man who lived and breathed the mountains. She laid out the question hypothetically, carefully, without mentioning Stefan's name. The guide was unequivocal, his voice firm with certainty. It's nearly impossible, he'd said, his words chillingly precise. To arrest a fall like that, you have to throw yourself to the ice, dig in with your axe, your crampons, everything you have. It's a violent, desperate act. You don't just scramble for purchase. The rope is your lifeline, but it's also a potential anchor dragging you to your death. He'd have injuries to show for it, serious injuries. Armed with this damning insight, Simona tried to bring her concerns to the authorities. She wrote letters to the gendarmerie, who had handled the case, laying out her logic in careful, precise detail, each word weighed with desperate hope. Responses were always polite, sympathetic, and utterly dismissive. An officer explained in a patient, almost condescending tone, that in the chaos of a storm and the profound trauma of the event, memories become unreliable. Perhaps the rope had snapped on a sharp edge of ice. Perhaps Stefan, in his panic state, had misremembered the exact sequence of events. They reminded her that his physical condition was proof of a genuine life-or-death struggle on the mountain, testament to his harrowing ordeal. Her questions were noted, they assured her, but with no body and no new evidence, the case remained closed. They treated her as what they believed she was, a grieving sister, unable to accept the senselessness of a random accident. Looking for patterns in the chaos, seeking meaning where there was only tragedy. Her persistence became a source of quiet friction within her own family. Her parents, devastated by their loss, had accepted the official conclusion, needing to find peace. They found Simona's quiet investigation morbid, a refusal to let Petra rest in peace. They saw Stefan as a fellow victim, a young man who had loved their daughter and had almost died with her. Simona's gnawing doubt was something she was forced to carry alone, a heavy burden in her lonely quest for truth. Years turned into a decade, then 2. The file on Petra Kruger was moved from a filing cabinet to a dusty box, and from the box to a deep storage archive in the silent, forgotten basement of the police station. It was officially a cold case, but not one that anyone ever expected to thaw. In 2021, 19 long years after Petra vanished, the lead investigator on the original case, a man named Kurt Beyer, retired. During a small, understated farewell gathering, a junior officer, young and eager, asked him about the cases that stuck with him over his long career. Beyer, a man of few words, stared into his beer for a long moment before answering, his gaze distant. He mentioned a few unsolved burglaries, a particularly stubborn hit-and-run, and then he paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. "The Kruger girl," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The one lost on the Glacier back in 2002. The junior officer was surprised, but that was an accident, wasn't it?" Tragic but straightforward. Beyer took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes still distant. "On paper, yes. But the sister, she used to call every year for a while. She was sharp. She had a question about the rope that we never could answer to anyone's satisfaction." "Not really." He shrugged as if to dismiss it, a fleeting gesture. "Probably nothing. In the mountains, strange things happen, unpredictable things. But it was a loose end, always felt like a loose end. left it at that, a fleeting comment born from a professional hunch he could never prove, a quiet ripple of doubt in a sea of accepted truth. It was the last time Petra Kruger's name would be officially mentioned for a long, long time. The file remained in its box, buried under 2 decades of other people's tragedies, waiting for the mountain itself to offer up a new and far more terrifying piece of evidence. For 20 years, the glacier held its secret. It moved with the silent, imperceptible power of geological time, a river of ice flowing downhill at a rate of mere inches per day. The place where Petra Kruger had vanished was buried under season after season of new snow, which compacted into dense layers of fern and then finally into the crystalline blue of glacial ice. Her tomb was sealed, moving slowly but inexorably toward the mountain's lower reaches. A perfectly preserved capsule of a terrifying moment. The world changed, technology evolved, people aged, but the ice remained, a silent, frozen witness. Then came the autumn of 2022. It was a season of anomalies, stark departure from the familiar rhythm of the Alps. A prolonged, brutally hot summer across Europe had been followed by an autumn that stubbornly refused to yield to the cold. Record-breaking temperatures persisted into October, a time when the high Alps should have been receiving their first heavy snows, a blanket of pristine white. Instead, the sun beat down on the glaciers with an unnatural, relentless intensity, like a vengeful eye. The ice, which had been in a slow retreat for decades due to climate change, began to melt at an accelerated, alarming rate, shedding its ancient skin.
Ow.
These unprecedented conditions created a perfect storm for instability. The meltwater seeped deep into the fissures and cracks of the glacier, lubricating the ancient ice from within, turning its solid heart into a treacherous fluid mass. High on a remote face of the mountain range, a different face entirely. Miles away from the quadrant searched so desperately in 2002, the breaking point was reached. It began with a deep, guttural, groaning crack that echoed through the empty valleys like a thunderclap, a sound of unimaginable power. Then, with a terrifying, earth-shattering roar, a massive section of the glacier broke free. It was not a simple avalanche of snow. It was a catastrophic collapse of the ice itself, a geological event of immense scale. Millions of tons of ancient ice, rock, and debris, a section of the mountain that had been stable for centuries, let go. It cascaded down the slope in a churning, grinding wave, scouring the mountainside down to the bedrock, exposing its raw, ancient foundations. The event was so immense it registered on seismographs across the region, a geological spasm that permanently redrew the maps of that part of the range. When the dust and ice crystals finally settled, a new landscape had been born, raw and exposed. The mountain's ancient blue heart laid bare for the first time in human history. Weeks later, a lone figure was making his way across this newly altered terrain. He was a ski mountaineer named Leo, a local man who sought the solitude and raw challenge of exploring the Alps' most remote, untouched corners. He was drawn to the site of the avalanche, fascinated by the raw, untamed power of the event and the unique opportunity to ski on terrain no one had ever touched, a fresh canvas of ice and rock. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew the mountains, his skis gliding effortlessly over the scarred, uneven surface of what remained of the glacier's base. The scene was surreal, almost alien. It was a boneyard of ice, with colossal house-sized seracs of ancient blue ice jutting out at odd, precarious angles, interspersed with vast fields of rubble and rock. It was in this stark alien landscape that Leo spotted it. From a distance, it was just a splash of incongruous color against the overwhelming palette of blue, white, and gray. It was a flash of something bright, something that didn't belong, a vibrant pink and purple. Curiosity piqued, a prickle of unease already running down his spine. He angled his skis toward the object, navigating around a large block of ice, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. As he drew closer, the colors resolved into what was clearly fabric, tattered and frayed, emerging defiantly from the edge of a melting sheet of ice. He stopped, planting his poles firmly in the soft, sun-cupped ice, and the prickle of unease intensified into a cold dread. This was not a recently discarded piece of litter. This was old, weathered, and it was attached to something. He knelt down, his skis sinking slightly into the slushy surface. He reached out a gloved hand and gently, almost reverently, brushed away some of the surface slush. The fabric was part of a jacket sleeve, and emerging from the sleeve was the unmistakable pale curve of bone. Leo recoiled, his heart hammering against his ribs, a sickening thud in the silent vastness of the mountains. Odd. He looked more closely, his eyes scanning the area around the fabric, his breath caught in his throat. Just a few feet away, lying partially submerged in a meltwater pool atop the ice, was a human skull. It was bleached and weathered, but largely intact, a chilling testament to the passage of time. As he stared, mesmerized and horrified, he saw more. Other bones, ribs, vertebrae were scattered nearby, slowly, agonizingly melting out of their icy prison, a scattered, partial skeleton being offered up by the thawing glacier. Then he saw the boot. It was a single mountaineering boot, heavy and made of a slightly older style of leather. A yellow-strapped crampon was still attached to its sole, its menacing metal spikes looking almost alive even while at rest. The boot lay on its side, as if it had been tossed aside, discarded in haste. Leo knew immediately what he had found. The mountain, after 2 decades, was finally giving back one of its lost souls. His training kicked in. He didn't touch anything else. Not a single bone, not a shred of fabric. He pulled out his phone, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and noted his exact location with trembling precision. He took several photos of the scene from different angles, capturing the position of the skull, the fabric, and the boot relative to each other, a silent, digital witness to the unspeakable. The gravity of the discovery was immense, almost overwhelming. He was standing at a grave, one that had been hidden for years, and he was its first horrified witness. With the evidence documented on his phone, he carefully backed away, his mind racing, a whirl of disquieting thoughts. His solitary adventure had just intersected, violently, with someone else's long-finished tragedy. He turned his skis downhill and began the descent. The image of the skull and the bright pink fabric burned into his mind. He had to tell someone. He had to report what the mountain had revealed. The call from the ski mountaineer sent a jolt through the regional gendarmerie. The discovery of human remains in the high Alps was not an everyday occurrence, but neither was it entirely unheard of. The mountains held many secrets, and melting glaciers had, with increasing frequency, due to climate change, been surrendering the bodies of climbers lost decades ago. The initial response was procedural, almost routine. A team was assembled, comprising forensic specialists and members of the Alpine Police Unit officers who were as comfortable on a vertical ice wall as they were in an office. The helicopter ride to the coordinates Leo provided was tense, the silence inside broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the rotors. The sheer scale of the avalanche's devastation was breathtaking, a testament to the mountain's raw, untamed power. The team landed as close as they could, then made the final approach on foot, their boots crunching on the alien terrain of ice and rock. Each step a testament to the solemnity of their mission. Leo was there, having agreed to guide them, and he pointed to the spot, his face pale, still haunted by the grim tableau. The scene was exactly as he had described, a grim tableau set against the stunning, indifferent backdrop of the Alps. The forensic team immediately went to work, establishing a perimeter, each movement slow and deliberate, precise. This was not just a recovery, it was an archaeological excavation of a modern tragedy, a careful unearthing of a story. They photographed everything, documenting the precise location and orientation of each bone, each scrap of clothing before anything was touched, before the delicate balance of the scene was disturbed. The air was thin and cold, and the only sounds were the clicking of cameras, the quiet murmur of professional instructions, and the distant, mournful drip of melting ice. The pink and purple fabric was the first clear identifier, a splash of vibrant color in a monochrome world. An officer who had been a junior constable in the region for years felt a flicker of recognition, a memory stirring from the depths of the station's lore. He was too young to have worked the original case, but he had heard the stories, the hushed whispers of a lost climber. Kruger, he said, more to himself than anyone else, his voice a low murmur. The girl from O2. A quick check of the cold case database back at headquarters. A few rapid keystrokes confirmed his hunch. The clothing was an exact match for the distinctive jacket worn by Petra Kruger in the last known photograph of her, the one pinned at base camp for 2 decades. As the team carefully worked to excavate the remains from the ice, a somber sense of purpose settled over them. They were finally bringing Petra home, a solemn act of repatriation after 20 years. The scattered nature of the bones was consistent with 2 decades of glacial movement in the recent violent avalanche. Her body had been broken apart by the immense grinding pressure of the ice over time, its cruel, slow embrace. They collected every fragment they could find, each one a precious piece of a puzzle, placing each carefully into sterile evidence bags. To boot, with the crampon, was catalogued and bagged separately, a silent, heavy witness. After hours of meticulous, heartbreaking work, they had recovered what was left of Petra Kruger. The news was delivered to Simona Kruger in person, a somber knock on her door. 2 plainclothed officers arrived, their expressions gentle, their faces etched with quiet sympathy. When they told her that Petra's remains had been found, Simona felt a complex wave of emotions wash over her, a tsunami of conflicting feelings. There was the sharp, renewed pain of loss, a fresh wound opening in her heart, but beneath it, a profound, soul-deep sense of relief. For 20 years, her sister had been lost in a nameless, frozen tomb, a silent void. Now she had been found. There could be a burial, a headstone, a place to mourn, a concrete spot for her grief. The uncertainty that had haunted her for half her life was finally, mercifully, over. But that sense of closure would prove to be cruelly fleeting. The remains were transported to the Regional Forensic Institute for examination by the chief pathologist, Dr. Elise Brandt. Dr. Brandt was a meticulous, no-nonsense professional, a woman who had seen everything the mountains could do to a human body, every form of trauma, every variation of death. She began her work expecting to document the fractures and trauma consistent with a long fall into a crevasse, followed by 2 decades of being crushed within a glacier's slow, inexorable embrace. She laid out the bone fragments on the gleaming stainless steel examination table, her gloved hands moving with practiced precision. The first thing she noted was the skull. It was remarkably well preserved in some respects, yet horrifically damaged in others. As she began her detailed examination, a deep frown creased her brow, a ripple of unease across her usually impassive face. Something was profoundly wrong. The damage wasn't random, the chaotic result of a fall. Falls, even catastrophic ones, tended to produce certain types of injuries, massive compression fractures, radiating fracture lines from a single major point of impact. The damage to Petra's skull was different, chillingly so. Dr. Brandt identified multiple distinct points of trauma. There were several small, almost circular puncture wounds that had pierced the cranium, concentrated chillingly on the top and back of the skull. Alongside these punctures were larger, shattered areas, as if the bone had been crushed inwards by repeated focused blows. She picked up a magnifying lens, her focus intensifying, her mind racing, a cold dread beginning to seep into her. These were not the chaotic injuries of a body tumbling into an icy chasm. This was patterned, targeted violence. The puncture wounds, in particular, were chillingly regular, almost uniform. They looked like someone had tried to drive a spike through the bone with deliberate, brutal intent. She cross-referenced the damage with her extensive database of trauma injuries, her fingers flying across the keyboard. It didn't match falls. It didn't match rock falls. It looked unmistakably like an assault. Dr. Brandt paused her examination, her heart now hammering in her chest, and walked over to a separate table where the evidence recovered from the scene was laid out. She looked at the tattered clothing, the worn backpack, and then her eyes fell on the boot and its attached crampon. She stared at the sharp steel spikes, 12 points designed to bite into solid ice, to offer purchase and safety. She returned to the skull, her mind racing, connecting the grim dots. She took a sterile caliper and measured the diameter of one of the puncture wounds. Then she went back and measured the diameter of a crampon spike. The numbers were a near-perfect match. A cold, sickening dread washed over her, chilling her to the bone. She now understood the horrifying pattern of violence. The puncture wounds were from the sharp, brutal points of the crampon. The crushing injuries were from the frame of the crampon being stomped or slammed down with immense, bone-shattering force. Petra Kruger had not died in an accidental fall. She had been bludgeoned to death, and the murder weapon was the most basic and essential piece of mountaineering equipment, an instrument of safety twisted into a tool of death. Dr. Brandt picked up her phone, her hand trembling slightly, and made a call that would change everything, that would shatter a 2-day code narrative. "This isn't an accident," she told the lead investigator on the new case, her voice firm, resolute. "This is a homicide." The revelation sent shockwaves through the department, reverberating through the quiet halls. The dusty 2-decade file on Petra Kruger was reopened with a new, terrifying urgency, transforming from a cold case into an active, burning murder investigation. The lead investigator, a sharp, intuitive detective named Thomas Ziegler, immediately focused on the grim, undeniable evidence. He pulled up the crime scene photos Leo had taken alongside the official forensic shots, the images stark and chilling. He stared at the boot, a silent accuser, and then he pulled up the file from 2002. Clicking on the digital photos sent by the German tourists so many years ago, he placed the images side by side on his monitor, a horrifying juxtaposition. On the left, a vibrant, smiling Stefan Fischer, his feet clad in heavy mountaineering boots with distinctive yellow straps on the crampons, full of life and joy. On the right, the single boot found miles away with Petra's remains. Its yellow strap faded but unmistakable, a ghost of its former self. It was the same make, the same model, beyond a shadow of a doubt. But there was more, a damning detail that clenched Ziegler's gut. He looked at the sizing information logged by the forensic team. The boot was a European size 45. It was a man's boot. It was Stefan's size. It could not have been Petra's. A horrifying new theory began to form, a narrative far darker, far more sinister than a simple accident. The location of the body, miles from where Stefan claimed the accident happened. The nature of the injuries, a brutal, targeted assault. And now, the presence of a boot that could only belong to Stefan, found right alongside her remains. It suggested a confrontation, an attack, and a killer who had somehow lost a piece of his own equipment in the violent struggle, or its desperate aftermath. The mountain hadn't just given up a body. It had preserved a crime scene, and it was pointing with a terrifying, icy finger directly at one man. The forensic pathologist's report landed on Detective Thomas Ziegler's desk with the force of an indictment. Each word a hammer blow of truth. The words homicide, blunt force trauma, and patterned injuries consistent with a weaponized crampon transformed a 2-decade-old tragedy into an active murder investigation. The file on Petra Kruger, once a dusty relic of a presumed accident, was now the center of a storm of activity, a whirlwind of desperate questions and grim possibilities. There was no question about the primary and only person of interest, Stefan Fischer. Ziegler was a man who trusted process, a man of meticulous detail. He began by building a timeline, laying out the facts of 2002 against the stark, undeniable new reality of 2022. The discrepancies were glaring, impossible to ignore. The location of the body was the most damning inconsistency. Glacier's move, yes, but not in the way Stefan would need them to, not with such impossible precision. Ziegler consulted with a team of glaciologists who confirmed that, for Petra's body to end up at the discovery site, she would have had to fall into a crevasse on a completely different part of the mountain range, miles away from where the official 202 search had been concentrated based on Stefan's own testimony. He had sent the rescuers on a wild goose chase, a desperate, futile pursuit. The question was why? The answer seemed terrifyingly obvious. To ensure Petra was never found, to ensure his secret remained buried forever. The investigation into Stefan Fischer began discreetly at first, a quiet, almost invisible tightening of the net. Ziegler's team needed to know who he was now, not just who he was 20 years ago. They discovered he was a highly successful architect, a partner in a prestigious firm in Hamburg, hundreds of miles from the silent, accusing peaks of the Alps. He was well respected, living in a minimalist, modern house with his long-term girlfriend, a talented landscape designer named Anna. He was, by all outward appearances, a man who had successfully compartmentalized his past, a pillar of his community. His life built on a foundation of meticulously constructed lies. Ziegler knew he had to tread carefully, meticulously. He needed more than just a theory and a 20-year-old boot. He needed something to tie Stefan Fischer, the 51-year-old architect, to the brutal events of 2002. He needed the other crampon. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. Most people wouldn't keep 2-decade-old mountaineering gear. But climbers were often sentimental about their equipment, especially gear that had been with them on significant life-altering trips. Working with the Hamburg police, Ziegler's team obtained a search warrant, broad and encompassing. It covered Stefan's home, his sleek, modern office, and crucially, a storage unit registered in his name at his parents' former address in a nearby suburb, a place where forgotten things often lay hidden. The raid was coordinated to happen simultaneously, a swift, decisive strike. While detectives arrived at Stefan's sleek, glass-walled office, another team led by Ziegler himself approached the unassuming roll-up door of a suburban storage facility, seemingly innocuous building that held the key to a decades-old mystery. The search of Stefan's home and office yielded nothing, not a single incriminating clue. But in the storage unit, amidst neatly stacked boxes of architectural drawings, old furniture, and forgotten household items, they found it. Tucked away in the very back corner, shrouded in a thin layer of dust, was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag. Inside was a collection of old mountaineering equipment, ice axes, ribboners, faded climbing rope, and a pair of worn leather boots. And attached to one of those boots, undeniable and chilling, was a single yellow-strapped crampon. It was the mate to the one found on the Glacier, a perfect, damning match. The crampon was carefully bagged and sent express to the Forensic Institute, a race against time. The team there was looking for something specific, something that could only be seen under a powerful microscope, something that would scream its story. They examined the 12 steel points of the crampon one by one, their breaths held. On 3 of the spikes, they found what they were looking for: microscopic stress fractures and infinitesimal flecks of metallic chipping embedded within the surface, silent witnesses to violence. A forensic metallurgist, a man who spoke the language of metals, was brought in. His conclusion was chilling, definitive. The damage was not consistent with the typical scraping and scratching of climbing on rock and ice. This was damage caused by repeated high-velocity impacts against a surface that had some give. But was ultimately hard, unyielding, a surface like human bone. When compared with the chips found on the matching crampon from the crime scene, the evidence became a matched set not just in make and model, but in the very story of violence their metallic structures told. It was time to talk to Stefan Fischer. The confrontation took place in a sterile, windowless interview room in a Hamburg police station, the air thick with unspoken tension. Stefan had been brought in under the guise of needing to clarify some details about the new, startling findings in Petra's case. He walked in with the calm, slightly weary air of a man who has long grown accustomed to being associated with a tragedy. His carefully constructed facade firmly in place. He sat down opposite Ziegler, his hands folded calmly on the table, his posture betraying nothing. Ziegler began gently, almost sympathetically, recapping the discovery of the remains. Expressing his condolences for the renewed grief Stefan must be feeling, Stefan nodded, his face a mask of somber acceptance, his eyes unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Ziegler slid a large, glossy photograph across the table. It was a close-up of Petra's skull, the patterned puncture wounds clearly, horrifyingly visible, an undeniable testament to brutality. Dr. Brandt, our pathologist, found these injuries, Ziegler said, his voice neutral, devoid of accusation, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. She says they are not consistent with a fall. Stefan stared at the photo, his eyes fixed, unblinking. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not shock, not grief, but something else, something cold and calculating. A momentary slip in his carefully maintained composure. "The Glacier, the Avalanche," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, a practiced lie rolling off his tongue. "It must have happened then. The rocks, the ice." Ziegler let the silence hang in the air, allowing the weight of the image to sink in, before pushing a second photo across the table. It was the boot and crampon, lying on the ice exactly where it was found, a silent, damning piece of evidence. "We found this near her body," Ziegler said, his gaze fixed on Stefan's face. "Our experts have identified it as a man's boot, size 45, your size, Herr Fischer." Stefan's composure began to crack, subtly at first, like hairline fissures in a frozen pond. A muscle twitched in his jaw, a telltale sign of internal struggle. "Many people wear those boots," he said, his voice a little strained, a desperate attempt to deflect. "It's a popular brand." Indeed, Ziegler agreed, his voice still calm, almost conversational. "But then we found this." He placed a clear evidence bag on the table with a soft thud. Inside was the other crampon, the one from Stefan's storage unit, a mirror image of the one found on the Glacier. "This was in a bag with your old gear. It's the matching crampon." Stefan stared at the bag, his eyes wide and vacant. He seemed to shrink in his chair, his posture collapsing inwards. The color drained from his face, leaving it ashen, ghostly. "The location where she was found is miles from where you said the accident occurred," Ziegler continued, his voice hardening, each word a relentless hammer blow. "The glaciologists say it's impossible for the ice to have moved her that far. Her injuries were not from a fall. When your equipment was found at the scene, you told us you were roped together. How did you survive her fall without a single injury from the rope? How did your boot end up next to her body? How did her skull end up with holes that match your crampons?" The questions came one after another, a relentless barrage of cold logic and irrefutable evidence, dismantling the 2D Codlod story piece by agonizing piece. Stefan Fischer was no longer a grieving survivor. He was a suspect in a murder investigation, cornered by the ghost of a crime he thought the mountain had buried forever. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a dry, desperate gasp. He just stared at the crampon and the bag. The story he had told for 20 years dissolving into nothing, shattered by the truth. The interrogation room felt airless, suffocating. Stefan Fischer sat in silence, the immense weight of 20 years of deception pressing down on him, crushing him. His carefully constructed world, built upon a foundation of a single tragic lie, was crumbling under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights, each flicker a stark revelation. Yet even in his desperation, he did not confess. After a long, tense, agonizing silence, he uttered 2 words, barely a whisper. "My lawyer." The interview was terminated immediately. But for Detective Ziegler and the prosecution team, Stefan's silence was as damning as any confession. They were convinced they had their man. The evidence, though circumstantial, painted a cohesive and horrifying picture. A chilling narrative of betrayal and brutality. They began to assemble the case they would take to court, a narrative built from cutting-edge forensic science, geological certainty, and the quiet, persistent doubts that had haunted Simona Kruger for 2 long decades. The prosecutors knew it would not be an easy fight. A conviction would hinge on their ability to persuade a jury to believe a story that had no living witnesses besides the accused himself. The defense would be formidable, well-resourced, and cunning. They would argue that the passage of 20 years made any forensic conclusion unreliable, prone to error. They would hire their own experts, glaciologists, to testify about the unpredictable and powerful forces of a shifting glacier. Metallurgists to claim the damage to the crampons was inconclusive, and could easily have been caused by normal use. They would paint Stefan Fischer as a victim, a man who had suffered an unimaginable tragedy and was now being re-traumatized by a prosecution team building a fantasy out of ambiguous evidence. Reasonable doubt would be their mantra, their shield. To counter this, Ziegler's team had to dig deeper, tirelessly. They needed a motive. Why would a young man, seemingly deeply in love with his girlfriend, commit such a brutal, unthinkable act on a remote mountaintop? The question sent investigators back in time, re-interviewing the friends and acquaintances of Petra and Stefan from 2002, sifting through the echoes of the past. At first, people were reluctant to speak ill of the past, to tarnish a memory. The couple had been remembered as vibrant, happy, a perfect match, an idyllic image of young love. But as investigators gently probed, armed with the new, devastating knowledge that this was a homicide investigation, cracks began to appear in that idyllic image, tiny fissures revealing a darker truth. A former colleague of Petra's, her voice hushed with remembered apprehension, recalled a conversation in the weeks leading up to the fateful Alpine trip. Petra had been uncharacteristically subdued, her usual vivacity replaced by a quiet pensiveness. She had confessed that things with Stefan had become intense, suffocating. He was talking about marriage and settling down, about a future she wasn't sure she wanted. She had admitted in confidence that she was thinking of ending the relationship, of breaking free. She had hoped the trip to the Alps, a return to the activity that had first brought them together, would either fix things, rekindle the spark, or give her the clarity she desperately needed to leave. Another friend from their climbing club, a man who chose his words carefully, remembered Stefan's temperament, a darker edge to his charming persona. He was charming and charismatic, yes, but he had a possessive streak, a hidden darkness. He described an incident months before the trip where Stefan had gotten into a heated public argument with a man who was harmlessly flirting with Petra at a party. The friend described Stefan's anger as going from 0 to 100 in an instant, a sudden shocking flash of pure, unadulterated rage that was as quickly suppressed as it appeared, like a violent storm passing just as quickly as it arrived. A motive began to solidify, one as old as time itself: jealousy and control. The prosecution theorized that the final fatal confrontation had happened on that desolate glacial plateau, miles from any witness. Perhaps Petra had chosen that moment, in the stark, breathtaking beauty of the Alps, to tell Stefan it was over, to finally break free. An argument erupted in the thin, crisp air, emotions running impossibly high, raw and volatile. His temper, explosive and untamed, had flared, consuming him. The ensuing violence was not premeditated, they argued, but a spontaneous explosion of rage, sudden, brutal act of desperation. He had used what was at hand, or rather on his feet, his crampons. He had attacked her, brutally, viciously, and in the desperate struggle, his own boot had come off, a silent, damning witness to the violence. He had then concocted the story of the crevasse, a plausible lie in an environment where accidents were tragically common. He had directed the search party to the wrong location, confident the vast, indifferent mountain would keep his dark secret forever. His frostbite, his harrowing tale of survival, it was all real, but it was the result of his own desperate, panicked escape after committing murder, not a tragic accident. The circumstantial case was strong, a tightly woven web of interconnected evidence: location, the brutal injuries, the weapon, the chilling motive. It all pointed relentlessly to Stefan. But the crucial lack of a confession or a direct witness meant the reasonable doubt argument loomed large, a persistent shadow over their efforts. The prosecutors and Ziegler's team debated their next steps, their voices hushed, their expressions grim. They could arrest him now and risk a difficult, drawn-out trial, one that could easily fail. Or they could continue to build their case, hoping to find one more piece of irrefutable evidence, one more witness from the past that would make his conviction a certainty, unassailable. They decided to wait, to tighten the net, believing time was on their side, that he was theirs for the taking. They placed Stefan under discreet but constant surveillance, a silent, invisible cage. They were confident he was trapped, his movements observed, his life a transparent book to them. But they underestimated his desperation, the cunning born of a lifetime of deception. The pressure on Stefan Fischer was immense, invisible to the outside world, yet crushing. While he walked free, he was a prisoner of the investigation, a man living under a microscope. He knew he was being watched, felt the constant, unsettling gaze. He saw the unmarked cars parked down the street from his home, subtly out of place. The same unfamiliar faces appearing at the coffee shop near his office, too often, too conveniently. His lawyer had been blunt, brutally honest. The circumstantial case, while not a slam dunk, was dangerously compelling. While they could fight it in court, the outcome was far from certain. The forensic evidence of the skull, combined with the discovery of his own equipment at the scene, created a narrative that a jury would find incredibly difficult to ignore, a story of violence that screamed for justice. An acquittal was possible, yes, but so was a life sentence, the specter of a prison cell looming large. Stefan was living on a knife's edge, each day a precarious balance. The ghost of Petra Kruger, the woman he had murdered, was closer than she had been in 20 years, breathing down his neck. He and his girlfriend, Anna, became increasingly reclusive, retreating into the confines of their minimalist, modern house. The curtains of their sleek, glass-walled home were kept drawn, shutting out the world. Friends who called found their invitations politely but firmly declined, their excuses vague and unconvincing. To the outside world, it looked like a couple buckling under the strain of a reopened wound, a shared grief. In reality, it was a period of frantic secret planning, a desperate scramble for survival. The prosecution, still meticulously building its case and preparing for the complexities of a trial based on 20-year-old evidence, believed they had him contained, effectively neutralized. They were in the process of securing the final expert reports, dotting every I and crossing every T, and scheduling grand jury presentations. They felt the arrest was weeks, not days away, a carefully orchestrated move. This methodical pace, born of a desire for an unassailable case, a conviction that would stand the test of time, inadvertently created a small, crucial window of opportunity. It was a window Stefan Fischer, a man of ruthless cunning and desperate self-preservation, intended to leap through. One Thursday morning, the surveillance team noted nothing out of the ordinary. Anna left the house for work as usual, a mundane sight. Stefan's car remained in the driveway, seemingly undisturbed. It wasn't until late the next day that the alarm bells began to ring, a discordant, urgent clamor. A junior detective reviewing routine financial flags noticed a series of massive electronic fund transfers, a cascade of money disappearing. Stefan's personal and business accounts had been systematically emptied over the past 48 hours. The money wired through a complex, dizzying chain of international banks, a digital trail designed to confuse and obscure. Simultaneously, another agent discovered that the sale of their house, which had been quietly on the market for a month, had closed 3 days prior, a chilling, prearranged departure. Panic set in. Ziegler's team descended on the house, this time with a newly issued arrest warrant in hand, their urgency palpable. They breached the door to find a home that was eerily, disturbingly empty. It wasn't just vacant, it was sterile, stripped bare. There were no clothes in the closets, no food in the refrigerator, no personal effects whatsoever. Even the indentations in the carpet where furniture had once stood were fading, a ghostly imprint of a life already erased. They had been gone for at least a day, maybe more. A frantic, large-scale manhunt was launched. Airport and border alerts were issued, flashing red across systems, but it was too late. Investigators quickly uncovered the couple's escape route, a meticulously planned vanishing act. Using secondary passports they had acquired months earlier, chilling foresight, Stefan and Anna had driven to a neighboring country, discreetly crossing an almost unnoticed border. From there, they had boarded a flight. Not from a major international hub where they might be recognized, but a smaller regional airport, a deliberate choice for anonymity. Their destination was a major transit hub in Southeast Asia, a place known for its labyrinthine cities and porous borders, a perfect place to disappear. And from there, the trail went cold, utterly, completely. They had vanished, dissolving into the teeming anonymity of a continent, two ghosts slipping into the shadows. For Simona Kruger, the news was the final, devastating blow, a cruel twist of the knife. The discovery of her sister's body had brought a sliver of peace, the promise of justice, a faint glimmer of hope in the darkness. Now that promise was snatched away cruelly, irrevocably. Stefan's flight was a confession in its own right, a clear admission of guilt in the court of public opinion, a silent scream of culpability. But it was not the justice she had waited 2 decades for. There would be no trial, no verdict, no moment of accountability where the world would formally acknowledge what he had done to her beloved sister. The mountain had held its secrets, then revealed them, but the man who committed the unspeakable act had slipped away, leaving only an enduring echo of his crime and his sister's unending heartache. The echoes of a scream lost to the blizzard, a secret kept by the silent, shifting ice. Petra's story is a heartbreaking journey from tragic accident to unthinkable betrayal. It's a powerful testament to the bonds of family and the truth that eventually always finds a way to surface. If this tale moved you, please give this video a like. And to join us for more deep dives into the mysteries that haunt our world, subscribe and become part of our community. Thank you for watching.